The Middle Ages were an age of darkness, of chaos, of superstition and religious fervor, of backwardness and misery, or that's what we're told, anyway. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back to Champagne Anarchism and this read-through of David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. We are in Chapter 10 today, and if you're following along, you know that means I'm deciding after all to split up Chapters 10 and 11. Originally, I'd meant to do them together, but I felt like it was a little bit of too much to ask people to read through 100 pages of material just for one video, so we're splitting it into two, and that'll be the structure for the rest of this series on Graeber's Debt. So next week, we'll be in Chapter 11, Chapter 12, after that, and then we'll finish off with the final last looks video, which will just be for Patreon subscribers. So do head over to the Patreon channel if you're not there already, patreon.com/Champagne Anarchism. And by the way, all of this probably looks different behind me. It's because I'm recording from the United States, and I'll be here for a little while, so a couple videos coming up are also going to look like this. Anyway, Chapter 10 is all about the Middle Ages, which for Graeber means the years 600 to 1450. Now, that is a very rough timeline. If you ask a medieval historian, they'll probably say that the Middle Ages started in the year 500. Some people put it around the year 476, which is the official fall of the Roman Empire, which kicks off the Middle Ages in Western Europe. Graeber himself points out that the Middle Ages, meaning the fall of these great axial age empires that we talked about last time, that Middle Ages starts very early in places like India and China. You'll see him refer in here, for example, to the fall of the Han Dynasty in China. That doesn't happen until 220 CE, which is a full 400 years before his official date of 600, the year 600. And by the way, in this chapter, you'll see Graeber refer to things like the High Middle Ages, which is roughly between the year 1000 and 1300. People, when they talk about the Middle Ages, they will split it up into three periods: the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the late Middle Ages or medieval period. None of this is exact. These are huge, sweeping changes and gigantic trends that we are talking about, so it's a little rough and ready. The dates will vary, and that is absolutely fine. But in this chapter, as we look at the Middle Ages, Graeber is asking us to suspend many of our assumptions about this age. We tend to learn in school, for example, that after Rome fell, the entire world entered this period of darkness. The images that you might already have in mind of sort of peasants in the midst of sickness and misery, scrounging for gruel, that is kind of the picture that we're presented about the Middle Ages. That Rome was this soaring moment of beauty and intellectual triumph and greatness, and then after Rome fell, the world fell into barbarism and destitution. And Graeber goes, well, okay, hang on. Because first of all, this image that we're presented with is all from a Western European perspective. And Western Europe was absolutely a backwater in this particular global era. So we do need to look at the rest of the world, and not just Europe, what the rest of the world looks like after the fall of the axial age empires. But also, when you look at the Middle Ages and the collapse of the great empires, in many ways, this is a moment that Graeber calls transcendent. Now, that is a philosophical distinction, but it is also kind of a reality. For one thing, you have the almost total collapse of slavery, especially the type of slavery that defined and underpinned the Roman Empire. You also, of course, have the rise of the great world religions that we know now, but in a slightly different form. Often, it's a form that rose up specifically to prevent things like usury, the forms of usury that had risen up in the axial age, and there were specific religious edicts against things like usury and the charging of interests and debt peonage and all of this. It was also an era in which societies began to believe that value lay outside of the thing itself. We talked about this transition from credit money to bullion, this sort of tick-tock, this pendulum that defines our entire human history that Graeber is trying to frame for us. And this is absolutely an era of credit money. This is a time in which people are starting to say, okay, value itself is not defined by the literal hard currency or the market or even the government. And that as a concept is going to be really important for what we're going to talk about today. Now, of course, we should not romanticize the Middle Ages by any means. Graeber points out very early in this chapter that literacy rates, for example, absolutely plunged. You had debt peonage in plenty of places that replaced slavery in many instances. You also see, and we'll talk about this at the end of the video, but the roots of modern capitalism start to emerge. But in many ways, your average person during the Middle Ages was way better off than they were during the Axial Age on a number of different counts. So let's suspend our assumptions for now about the Middle Ages and dive into Graeber's argument here. I am going to split this video into 3 different sections. First of all, we are going to talk about the rise of the great religions. Then we're going to go to the disappearance of coins. And finally, we're going to finish off with the roots of capitalism. I'm messing with Graeber's structure here. Graeber takes us through these 4 great religions. He talks about Confucianism, which isn't really a religion, more of an organizing philosophy, but Confucianism, Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity. And that's the way that this chapter is structured, but I'm going to mess a little bit with that structure just to pull out kind of the key arguments here and think about them in the broader context of the chapter in the book. So we're going to go into each one of these, and the idea that I want you to hold in your head as we go through this is that Graeber really is trying to tell a version of this story that ultimately, as the foundations of modern capitalism is not a story that can be told in one chapter or one book or even really a library. If you read through Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch with me on this channel, you will already know a lot about this particular period, and it's worth talking about Federici. Federici in Caliban and the Witch makes a separate but parallel argument about the Middle Ages. She says that early on in the Middle Ages, women actually had a fairly substantial amount of power that gradually and systematically was eroded by the states and elites throughout the medieval period, I should say. She tells us that the enclosure, this is the word that she uses, the enclosure of the female body predates the actual enclosures of England. Those enclosures, of course, privatized public lands. They basically fenced them off and sold them off. It predates colonization, of course, which gave us this vast system of extraction and enslavement and launches the world into modern capitalism. It predates all of that. Graeber doesn't talk about this element of the Middle Ages at all. He actually does reference Caliban and the Witch just in a note, so he is aware of Federici's argument here and her work, but in this part of the story, this particular section that he's telling, the subjugation of the female body doesn't really come into his analysis. That sounds like a criticism. It's actually not really a criticism. There's a lot for him to talk about here, and that's what I mean when I say this story of the Middle Ages and the foundations of modern capitalism can't be told in one chapter. Now, I would love to see, and you should, if you're reading this chapter, think of other things that you've seen, these kinds of explanations, and we've seen everything from people like Silvia Federici to Karl Marx, who also tells a story about this particular period in history. Marx's story, of course, starts much later, but there are people who tell other versions of this story, and it's interesting to compare and contrast. I, for example, would absolutely love to see the kind of analysis about the way that the medieval mind conceived of value and this leaving of the materialism of the Axial Age. Combine that with the medieval understanding of the magical body. The way that magic is seen as a source of power for the female body. These are really interesting things to consider together, but it's not like Graeber is missing the point. It's more that this is such a big story that both Federici's analysis, which says nothing about debt and coinage and money, and Graeber's analysis, which says nothing about magic and the female body and the subjugation of the female body, both of these are parallel, complementary, and kind of key to understanding this particular period in history. Anyway, enough of all this preamble. Let's talk about the rise of the great religions. So, how does a civilization maintain some semblance of the status quo when the empires that built that status quo have fallen. What is it, in other words, that comes in to replace state power? As you see the declines of the power of the state, what rises up to replace it? Well, if you're India or the Islamic world or Europe or to some extent China, the answer is that that authority was replaced by religious authority. In the Middle Ages, as the Axial Age empires faded, you start to see the power to regulate exchange coming under the power of the world's rising religions. Now, there are a number of these that pop up around the time, and of course, it's tough to talk about any of these religions as monolithic. There are schisms, there are doctrinal squabbles. The Islam and Confucianism that we're talking about here are not one monolithic thing. They are multiple separate things and many, many different thinkers within these traditions. But Graeber focuses this chapter on those four big religions. So Buddhism, Confucianism, again, only debatably religion, but Confucianism, Islam, and Christianity. The shift that happens with all of these, but in different ways, is that the age of gold and empire gives way to an age of moral accounting and credit money, this sort of move back to these older forms of virtual money. In India, for example, you have the failure of Emperor Ashoka's embrace of Buddhism. That empire didn't last, but the successor governments of Ashoka continued their support of Buddhism, and as the states of India, these empires began to weaken over time. As they did that, the Buddhist establishments of religious authority saw their power expand. Now, one of the ways that they typically exercised power in the Indian context was the permanent endowment, and Graeber talks quite a bit about this. The permanent endowment is when donors lend their money in the name of the temple, and then the interest payments on that loan go to support various things, various kind of specific religious purposes within the temple itself. We don't know terribly much about how these early arrangements worked in terms of the actual accounting units that were used. We know that gold did actually flow into these temples. We'll talk a little bit about this later when we talk about the decline of coinage, but we probably have to assume that a lot of this money, most of this money even, existed more as an accounting unit, not as the literal physical bullion, but just as a unit of account. You also had a pretty substantial devolution of power at the time to these local patronage networks within villages that were centered around Brahmins as the religious authorities. And because of all of this, the older forms of interest and usury changed pretty substantially. We see this, for example, in the Laws of Manu, which is an early Sanskrit legal text. In the Laws of Manu, it's not banning usury. It's not cracking down on interest payments in general. What it is, and that will come actually when we talk about the Islamic world, but what it is codifying the system of interest that is based on caste. So the lending, the repayment terms, and the interests that are charged depend on where you are in the social hierarchy, which again stems from this kind of religious structure with the Brahmin at the top. And Graeber talks about caste in really interesting terms here, because he points out that caste has really, although it is as hierarchical as it gets, it has nothing to do with the market. You are born into your caste. You cannot escape it. It's a rule of the universe. It's just sort of handed to you. There's nothing that you can do to get out of that caste. Debt and money relations are based on that caste, so the caste does influence how the market works, but the market isn't actually dictating where in the hierarchy you stand. That's the religious authority. That's the universe. And of course, when the British came, there were multiple rebellions over debt peonage, but not over caste, which is very interesting to note. Graeber says here, debt peonage, it would appear, is far more likely to inspire outrage and collective action than is a system premised on pure inequality. Meanwhile, in China, the Han Dynasty collapses around 220 CE, but its bureaucracy, which is one of the most sophisticated around, and one of the most sophisticated in history, in fact, never really disappears. And it was Confucianism that provided a stable moral center. even though the political center was fracturing. In China, there were barbarians to the north, there were popular uprisings in the countryside, quite a few popular uprisings in the countryside, which you will know if you read this, and yet the Chinese state kind of survives by constantly reabsorbing these rebellions. So the Chinese history becomes something like a cycle of crises, followed by uprisings, followed by a government crackdown on usury. And with this Confucian bureaucracy, there's a really interesting tension. Confucian bureaucracy mostly fostered markets, but it actually despised profit-seeking. So it was, in other words, or in Graeber's words anyway, pro-market but anti-capitalist. It's not just the Confucian bureaucracy, though. It's also Buddhism, which begins to take root after the Han Dynasty fell. And here you see some hints of something that we talked about before. And that is, of course, the infinite debt to the universe. Buddhism turned morality into a cosmic economy. Karmic debt became everything. And Graeber calls it a phrase that I really love, salvation as an installment plan. That's basically your karmic debt to the universe, right? You're just always constantly over your lifetimes and into eternity working this off. He also talks about the idea of milk debt. This is also where we get the idea of milk debt, which is the unpayable debt that you owe to your mother for the milk that she provided when you were a baby. This is, again, something that literally just cannot be paid back. You are eternally in this debt. The eternal debt, in other words, to the universe, or to your mother in this case. And again, just more examples of why we're falling away from the Boolean economy here and more into an economy of morality and debt to the universe. These are different conceptions of the economy and what it is. But before we get into kind of summarizing all of this, let's talk about the Islamic world. So Buddhism and Confucianism are creating what you might call sort of sacred economies, right? There are economies that are run in the context of religious law, but Islam is turning commerce itself into a moral act. And what you have to know for this is that for most of the medieval period, the economic nerve center of the world was the Islamic world. Not Europe. Get that idea out of your head. It's the Islamic world that is the beating heart of the global economy. And of course, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all emerge, all three of them, from the same intellectual religious tradition. But of those three, Islam is the most successful in this period to fuse faith and trade. One of the examples that Graeber talks about in here is that it made it impossible to sell monotheists, basically, Muslims, of course, but also Christians and Jews, into slavery. That is a literal religious edict against the very thing that provided the foundation for the axial age empires that preceded it. And of course, it strictly forbade usury. Now, Islam never really turned away from the marketplace. Instead, what there were tight kind of moral controls on the marketplace. Profit was fine, but profit was limited. And commerce, of course, became something that was almost sacred. Everywhere in the Islamic world, you had flourishing credit instruments, from promissory notes to checks to something that looks a lot like institutional banking, profit-sharing partnerships, which were preferred to sort of fixed interest payments on investments. The economy in the Islamic world ran on trust, and these merchants became, in this context, very much sort of moral figures, intrepid adventurers, dashing adventurers. In fact, people like Sinbad in the Tale of Sinbad. Graeber points out here as well that the prophet himself, Muhammad, was a merchant. And so in the Islamic world, you have the idea that markets exist, but there are laws, the things that govern markets, including prices. Prices, Muhammad preached against price fixing quite specifically because prices are determined by God. So the laws of the market are divine. In Europe, of course, things were different. The church in the Middle Ages cracked down very hard on usury. That prohibition is pretty clear in the Bible, but Graeber mentions a very famous exception to the ban on usury and lending at interest, and that comes to us from Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy, you get the line that allows an exception for usury or the lending of money at interest in the case of a stranger. So if you are dealing with a fellow Christian, you cannot lend at interest, but if you're dealing with a stranger, meaning probably in the sense of Deuteronomy, but this is interpreted in many different ways throughout history, probably probably an enemy, you are allowed to lend at interest. Now, this is very much in conflict with other areas of the Bible and the ways that those have been interpreted through time. But you're going to, if you are somebody who wants to lend at interest and can make a lot of money off that, chances are you're going to look pretty hard at this specific line for your justification, and you might fail to see some of the other ones that specifically prohibit it. But anyway, that sentence in Deuteronomy is going to shape pretty much the next couple thousand years. Now, we talked about this before already, but Jewish people were often cast as the stranger in this role, right? The royalty of Europe used Jewish people to lend and then violently extracted payment. It was a system that was built on brutality and violence. This entire lending market, or the lending markets of Europe at the time, were based on this brutality and violence. But also, just like in every other context that we've talked about, they are still shaped by the church, by religious authority. And so that's just all to say that in each of these four cases, you have wildly different results, but you can see the rough outlines of a market that is shaped by religious belief and steered by religious authorities using notions of value that exist outside of just the hard metal that we've come to expect. But let's talk about metal, and let's talk specifically about the disappearance of coins. So across the medieval world, coins at this period started to dry up. Graeber tells us that in Europe, the old Roman coins stayed basically as accounting units, so people didn't actually use the coins, but they still thought and would tally things up in terms of those Roman coins. But everyday transactions that are going on, they stopped relying on metal almost entirely. Instead, you have a swing back to where we used to be, which is promises. And so you see the rise of things like tally sticks and credit instruments and multiple promises that are kind of kept at an incredibly local level. Western Europe was pretty suspicious of commerce, so the Islamic romantic figure of the wandering merchant, the Sinbad character, doesn't really exist in Christian Europe. Instead, you have the wandering knight, the errant knight, the agent of war, in other words, which Graeber kind of speculates is maybe the other side of the coin of this myth. So it's the myth of the traveling, adventuring merchant, this romantic figure, kind of remixed. So that's just an interesting idea that he presents us with. But either way, you do have some banking arrangements in medieval Europe. They are the least sophisticated of the four parts that we're looking at, but Graeber gives us, for example, the Knights Templar, who may have pioneered kind of the first major credit arrangements in the Christian world as a way to finance the Crusades. And eventually, of course, you have King Philip IV just turning on them, but throughout the rest of the world, you have remarkably sophisticated credit arrangements that keep popping up. And they pop up because of the lack of coins. So in India and China, for example, a lot of gold is going into these temples and monasteries where they're melted down and remade into statues, offerings, and sacred objects. And to such an extent, by the way, that a lot of rulers would just sack and attack religious authorities to melt down those statues to get coins to finance their military expeditions, whatever it was. Any kind of ruler who wanted to re-embrace the axial age military coinage slavery complex, you would have to take out this religious authority first. And so temples became financial institutions as well. They held these vast endowments that earned them interests in the name of the gods, and they became essentially a faith-based form of banking. They lent money out, they kept monastic ledgers, they made interest and profit on these things, basically everything. In China as well, you see the rise of flying cash arrangements, which are promissory notes that emerged during the Tang Dynasty, promissory notes that circulate among merchants who don't want to haul bullion from one corner to another for safety reasons. Right? It makes sense that you would want this sort of banking apparatus and these promissory notes so that you don't have to carry bullion that would open you up to raids and highway robbers. And during the Song Dynasty, that system is only expanded. Paper money and promissory notes begin to circulate widely, first among merchants and then under an eventual state monopoly. All of that culminates in the founding of the Bureau of Exchange in 1023 CE, which comes about to oversee this whole system. It is a system of abstract money. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, we've talked about this a little bit already, but you've got promissory notes, you've got long-distance banking networks, trading routes across the Indian Ocean as well that rely on networks of trust and essentially handshake agreements. It was one of the most advanced credit systems in the world. And so with all of this, you start to see Graeber's main trends. You have the rise of religious control over the marketplace and the rise of credit networks to replace bullion. But let's talk about this in slightly more philosophical terms. Let's talk about the abstraction of value and the roots of capitalism. Right. We've already said that for Graeber, the Middle Ages weren't an age of backwardness necessarily. They were what he calls an age of transcendence. He says, if the axial age was the age of materialism, the Middle Ages were above all else the age of transcendence. The collapse of the ancient empires did not, for the most part, lead to the rise of new ones. Instead, once subversive popular religious movements were catapulted into the status of dominant institutions. Slavery declined or disappeared, as did the overall level of violence. As trade picked up, so did the pace of technological innovation. Greater peace brought greater possibilities not only for the movement of silks and spices, but also of people and ideas. It is a world that sees money literally losing its weight. It's not physical or material, it's abstract, and hence that word, transcendence. Money circulates in symbols and ink and rituals and marks on tally sticks, and it's inextricably linked, all of this, to faith and religion. Now, the tally is the symbol, not the gold coin. No, the original tally is a stick that's split in half, and each half carries part of a record of shared debt. There's also friendship tallies, which Graeber talks about. And this tally is also where the word for symbol, our word for symbol, comes from. And in that ancient Greek tradition, Aristotle was obsessed with the tally. And of course, with the larger idea of the symbol, the abstract thing that stands in for something physical. We also see echoes of this in China's belief that you're constantly striking deals with the divine. The mandate of heaven is a reflection of this idea. And so with all of this, debt is a symbolic link between two different things, between two people, two friends perhaps, between groups, or between us and the divine, the spiritual, the gods. We also see throughout this period the idea that we've talked about before of eternal debt, a tally that can't ever be broken or discarded. You're just in debt constantly to something, to God, to the universe, to your mother's milk, perhaps to your society. And Graeber also throws out an idea that's an interesting idea. It might be a bit of a stretch, but it's an interesting idea nonetheless. He gives us this idea of the roots of the modern corporation. And the modern corporation, of course, is something that is eternal, that is an immortal, an angelic entity that cannot die, that exists beyond time, that is made up of human parts, but is bound by an abstract law. All of this, he says, is a direct descendant of the medieval imagination. Now again, that might be a bit of a stretch, but it should make some sense to us. And it leads Graeber to argue that this philosophical foundation lays the groundwork for what is to come. And you can see it throughout this entire story that he's telling, because what religion is doing throughout the world, throughout the medieval period, is holding back because it's responding to popular sentiment, right? It has to respond to the will of the people, at least early on it does. So it's holding back the forces that are going to become capitalism. The Catholic Church is cracking down really hard on usury. The Islamic world has massive trading empires but is suspicious of excess profit. It relies more on handshakes instead of contracts to make things run. In India, you have religious leaders that are literally actually holding the forces of the centralized state, the empire, at bay. And interests, meaning payments, are enshrined on a level of religious law. China's Confucian state, meanwhile, is intervening directly with the market to prevent this kind of market and capital to get out of hand. Remember the Chinese sort of suspicion of the merchant figure. So all of the elements are there. But for capitalism to truly begin, we need more of a spark. And we will get to that next week when we get to chapter 11, which is the age of the great capitalist empires. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.